Almost 3 years into her 15 years to life prison sentence, Mackenzie Shirilla's time behind bars has been far from quiet and trouble with authority.
Records obtained by 3 News show that Shirilla has received 36 disciplinary reports since entering the Ohio Reformatory for Women in August 2023.
Before the crash, before the courtroom, before the Netflix documentary, these were 3 real young people from Strongsville, Ohio. Not headlines. Not case numbers, people. And before you can understand what happened on Progress Drive at 5:34 in the morning, you need to understand who was in that car. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. He lived in Strongsville with his family, his mother Christine, his father Frank, and his sister Christine Jr., who would later become one of the most vocal public voices in this entire case. By every account, Dominic was warm, funny, the kind of young man whose family opened their home and whose absence would leave a shape in every room he used to fill. He was young in the way that still believed things would work out. He was 20 years old, and he never made it to 21. Davion Flanagan was 19 years old. And I want to say this clearly because Davion is arguably the most overlooked person in this entire story. And that is not right, and it needs to change. Davion was not Mackenzie's boyfriend. He was not part of whatever was happening between Mackenzie and Dominic. He was a friend who got into the wrong car at the wrong time. What most people never hear about Davion is that he had a whole future mapped out. He worked full-time after high school. He had applied to a hairstyling and barber college with plans to start in the fall of 2023. During the off-season, he worked part-time as a youth swim coach. He was building something real, something his own. That future was erased at 5:34 in the morning on Sunday. And then there is Mackenzie Shirilla. Born and raised in Strongsville, 17 years old the night everything collapsed. Publicly confident, socially active, the kind of teenager whose Instagram had clothing companies sending her free products to review. But behind that image, as nearly 93,000 text messages would later prove, was something far more complicated and far more volatile than anything she ever showed in public. These 3 people were connected by a relationship, and that relationship is the only way to understand what happened next. If you're new here, welcome to Viral Case Files. Hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We cover cases like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what is coming. Now, let us go deeper. Mackenzie and Dominic's relationship started when she was just 13 years old and he was 16. Her freshman year of high school, his final years before adulthood. They were together for 4 years. By 2021, they had moved in together at the Russo family home in Strongsville, which, when you think about it, tells you something right there. His family took her in. His mother opened her home to the girl her son was dating. On social media, they looked like any young couple finding their way. Smiling photos, shared moments, 2 people building something together. But the text messages told a completely different story. Between January 2020 and July 2022, Strongsville police recovered and released nearly 93,000 private text messages exchanged between Mackenzie and Dominic. 93,000. That is not a conversation. That is a paper trail. And what that trail showed was a relationship that had long since crossed the line from complicated into dangerous. In January 2022, Dominic sent Mackenzie a text that read, "You cannot go a day without threatening to break up with me." That single line tells you everything about the emotional climate they were living inside. But it did not stop there. On September 13th, 2021, Dominic alleged in a text message that Mackenzie had threatened to stab him in the eye after he made a joke she did not like. Her response to that accusation was, "Maybe if you just had my back, you would not be threatened." Then on March 11th, 2022, just 4 months before the crash, Dominic sent a detailed account of a physical altercation. He alleged that Mackenzie had refused to let him out of a car, struck him, pulled his hair, attempted to throw a rock at him, and threatened to call the police on him. When she told him to stop texting her that day, he said he could not do that unless she promised never to involve the police, ruin his life, key his car, or throw rocks at him again. Read that back slowly. That is what he felt he needed to extract as a promise just to feel safe. On July 2nd, 2022, less than 30 days before the crash, Dominic tried to end the relationship by text. He told her he loved her, but did not believe they should be together anymore. Mackenzie's response accused him of being a straight liar and a pathological manipulator. But here is where the picture becomes more complicated. And this matters, because the full truth always matters more than the convenient version. Mackenzie's own messages show that she felt like a victim too. In texts she allegedly sent to Dominic's mother, she claimed it was Dominic who had once grabbed the steering wheel while she was driving and attempted to steer the car into a crash himself. Her defense attorneys would later use this in court to argue the relationship was mutually destructive, not a clean, one-sided story of predator and victim, but two young people locked inside, something neither of them knew how to escape. And then came the moment that would become the most critical piece of pre-crash witness testimony in the entire trial. 2 weeks before July 31st, during a heated argument while the two of them were driving together, Mackenzie allegedly told Dominic she would crash the car. He called his mother from inside that moving vehicle. A friend was dispatched to come and get him. And a witness, standing close enough to hear, overheard Mackenzie say out loud on the phone, "I will crash this car right now." That was 2 weeks before she drove onto Progress Drive and did exactly that. And here is something prosecutors argued from the very beginning. That threat did not come from nowhere. They said she had already been to that road. They said she had already seen the building. They said she knew exactly where she was going. Progress Drive is not a road you end up on by accident. That is the first thing you need to understand before anything else in this chapter makes sense. It is not a through street. It does not connect two major roads. It does not sit on any logical route between a party and a home in Strongsville, Ohio. It is a dead-end road inside an industrial business park, the kind of street that exists purely to serve the warehouses and commercial buildings sitting along it. There is no reason for a 17-year-old girl to know that road exists. There is no reason for her to have driven it before, unless she went there on purpose. GPS data recovered from Mackenzie's phone and devices revealed that she had visited the exact stretch of road, Progress Drive, in that Strongsville industrial business park, in the days before July 31st, 2022. Not once as part of a regular routine. Not by coincidence. She had been there, on a road she had no ordinary reason to use, at the end of which sat the Plidco building, the same brick commercial structure she would drive into at nearly 100 miles per hour. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo addressed this directly at sentencing. The judge said that Mackenzie made a calculated decision to take that specific route, one she did not normally use, at a time of morning when very few people would be present to witness anything. The judge did not frame this as a spontaneous eruption of rage. She framed it as deliberate, premeditated planning. A reconnaissance trip, a dry run. This evidence was covered extensively in other documentaries and true crime productions following the conviction. It was notably absent from the Netflix documentary that brought this case to a global audience in May 2026. So when you watched that film and found yourself leaning towards sympathy, hold this detail in your mind and hold it firmly. She had been on that road before. She knew what was at the end of it. With the dry run established by GPS data, the prosecution's argument was no longer about a single night of rage. It was about a plan. And on the morning of July 31st, 2022, that plan reached its final step. There are cases where the evidence is circumstantial, where you have to connect dots and draw inferences and ask a jury to follow a logical chain from one point to another. This is not one of those cases. What happened between 5:30 and 5:34 in the morning on July 31st, 2022, was captured by GPS data, by a phone app, by surveillance cameras, and by the black box sitting inside the car itself. The timeline is not a theory. It is a record. At 5:30 in the morning, the black 2018 Toyota Camry begins moving westbound from Brushwood Lane in Strongsville. 3 people inside. Mackenzie Shirilla behind the wheel. Davion Flanagan in the rear passenger seat. Dominic Russo in the front. They had just left a party. According to police and court evidence, they were supposed to be heading back to the Russo home. That was the plan anyone watching them leave would have assumed. At 5:33 in the morning, the vehicle turns southbound onto Pearl Road. At 5:34 in the morning, it turns westbound onto Progress Drive. That is the turn. That is the moment everything changed. Because from the second that car moved onto Progress Drive, it did not slow down. It accelerated. The Life 360 app running on Davion Flanagan's phone recorded a high-speed data point in those final seconds, a reading that would later be fully corroborated by something far more precise and far more damning. The Toyota Camry's event data recorder, the black box built into the vehicle, captured the last 5 seconds before impact with a level of mechanical clarity that left no room for interpretation. In those 5 seconds, Mackenzie Shirilla's right foot was pressed to the accelerator at its full extent. The service brake pedal was never applied. Not once. Not a tap. Not a partial press. Nothing. The vehicle had no mechanical defects. Nothing was wrong with the car. It was doing exactly what the foot pressing the pedal told it to do. The car was traveling at nearly 100 miles per hour when it struck the Plidco building head-on, driving through a business sign and directly into the structure's brick face. The car did not glance off the wall. It did not clip a corner. It drove straight into it at full speed and was split nearly in two by the impact. At 6:15 in the morning, officers from the Strongsville Police Department arrived at the scene. What they found, described in body cam footage, was almost unrecognizable as a car. All 3 occupants were unconscious, not breathing, and trapped inside the wreckage. Davion Flanagan was extracted first. He had a brief, faint pulse. He was pronounced dead in the ambulance before he reached the hospital. Dominic Russo was confirmed deceased at the scene. Mackenzie Shirilla was freed from the wreckage and was briefly conscious. She spoke, asking about Davion by name and mentioning the name Jacob. A life flight helicopter transported her to Metro Health Hospital in Cleveland. She underwent surgery for broken bones in her right leg and right arm. Her alcohol screen came back negative. Found on her person at the scene and immediately seized by officers were 8.1 grams of psilocybin mushrooms and a digital scale. The car was destroyed. 2 young men were dead, and the girl behind the wheel was airlifted to a hospital with injuries that would heal, while the question of whether she had chosen that road, chosen that building, and chosen that moment was just beginning to take shape inside a police department that had not yet called it anything other than an accident. Here is something the initial headlines almost entirely missed. When Strongsville police first arrived at that scene on the morning of July 31st, 2022, they did not open a homicide investigation. They did not cordon off a crime scene in the way you would if you believed something deliberate had happened. They classified the deaths of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan as an accident. Un tragique, dévastating automobile accident. The Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office completed their review and concluded that both men died from blunt force injuries consistent with a high-speed crash. Standard findings. Standard report. Case closed in a way that cases get closed when everyone in the room assumes they already know what happened. What changed everything was not a detective with a hunch. It was not a forensic breakthrough in a laboratory. It was the families. After the crash, after the funerals, after the first wave of grief began to settle into something harder and more focused, the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan started paying attention to what Mackenzie was doing online. What they saw disturbed them deeply enough that they went directly to police and urged investigators to look at this case again. That pressure triggered a deeper investigation, and what detectives found when they began pulling her digital footprint apart changed the entire trajectory of what this case would become. Leading the digital investigation was Detective Zaki Hazu of the Strongsville Police Department. Detective Hazu uncovered videos on Mackenzie's social media accounts showing reckless driving behavior prior to the crash, including footage of her driving while smoking. He located the GPS data, placing her on Progress Drive before July 31st. He pulled the text message history between Mackenzie and Dominic, all 93,000 of them. Witness interviews were conducted. Prior incidents were surfaced and documented. Everything was assembled and taken to the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office. In March 2023, 8 months after the crash, the prosecution submitted that accumulated evidence to the Medical Examiner's Office. That submission included cell phone transcripts, still photographs, video footage, and witness statements. Based on that submission, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner amended the autopsy reports for both Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. The manner of death for both men was officially changed from accident to homicide. That single reclassification in March 2023 is what made the murder trial legally possible. Without it, without those families pushing back against an initial finding of accident, without Detective Hazu pulling apart her digital life piece by piece, Mackenzie Shirilla walks out of this story entirely free. A Cuyahoga County grand jury returned a 12-count indictment. She was charged with 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, 1 count of drug possession, and 1 count of possessing criminal tools. The case that began as a tragic accident was now a murder prosecution, and it was about to get a great deal more public. 3 months after Dominic and Davion died, Strongsville police had built what they believed was a case strong enough to move on. On November 4th, 2022, they did exactly that. Mackenzie Shirilla, now 18 years old, having crossed that birthday in the months since the crash, was placed under arrest. The body cam footage of that arrest is extraordinary. It was released publicly by Strongsville police in May 2026 following the Netflix documentary. And once you watch it, it is very difficult to forget. The lead detective approaches a police SUV where Mackenzie is already sitting handcuffed in the back seat. He opens the door, introduces himself as the investigator who had been working the crash, and then says it plainly and without ceremony. "You are under arrest for aggravated murder, ×2. Her response, delivered through tears, was to look down at her wrists and say, "Can you please be careful taking this one off so it does not break the bracelet, please?" She was more concerned about her jewelry than the charges that had just been read to her. The officer told her he would be careful and that he did not want to hurt her. That exchange, the murder charge and the bracelet in the same breath, became one of the most discussed moments in the entire case once the footage went public. Outside the Strongsville Police Department, a separate body cam captured Mackenzie's father, Steve Shirilla, arriving and immediately confronting officers. He demanded to see his daughter. He insisted detectives were not permitted to question her without him present. He accused police of having someone stationed outside his family's home watching them. When an officer calmly pointed out that Mackenzie was a legal adult who had the right to speak for herself, Steve Shirilla's response was, "Yeah, but she is a dumb 18-year-old. Inside the building, Mackenzie was placed in the back of a cruiser. According to reporting on the release footage, she looked directly into the interior camera mounted inside the vehicle, and then leaned over and appeared to go to sleep. Now step back from the arrest itself and look at what Mackenzie had been doing publicly in the 3 months between the crash and that November morning. Because the social media chapter of this story is one that stands entirely on its own, and it is the chapter that arguably destroyed whatever public sympathy she might otherwise have carried into a courtroom. 3 months after Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan died in that wreckage, Mackenzie posted videos on TikTok dressed as a corpse for Halloween. She described them as satirical. In another video, she lip-synced to a song containing the lyric, "I'm the girl you die for." In a third video, one that would later become directly relevant to her medical defense, she told her followers, "I am not even cool. I am just one of those girls that could do a lot of drugs and not die." She also posted on Dominic's obituary page, writing that he was the last person to deserve this, while being, at that same moment, the person investigators believe had put him there. Every one of those videos, every one of those posts was later collected and played in open court by Assistant Prosecutor Tim Troop. What Mackenzie posted in those 3 months while 2 families were burying their sons did not stay on social media. It followed her all the way into the courtroom, and it sat in front of the one person who would decide her entire future. Mackenzie Shirilla entered a not guilty plea. She had initially been processed through the juvenile system, but the juvenile court transferred her case to adult court, a significant legal step that did not happen automatically or without deliberation. It opened the door to a life sentence. It meant she would be tried as an adult for the deaths of 2 people. And once that transfer was complete, she made a decision that surprised a number of legal observers watching the case closely. She waived her right to a jury trial entirely and elected for a bench trial. No jury of 12. No deliberation room. No unanimous verdict required. One person, one judge, everything resting on a single set of eyes and a single legal mind. That judge was Cuyahoga County Common, pleased Judge Nancy Margaret Russo. No relation to Dominic Russo. That coincidence of shared surnames will be noted repeatedly throughout the proceedings and beyond. The 4-day bench trial was constructed around 3 central pillars for the prosecution, led by Assistant Prosecutor Tim Troop. The first was the surveillance footage of the crash itself, played in open court, showing the Camry moving onto Progress Drive and accelerating into the Plitco building with no visible reduction in speed, no swerving, no last-second attempt to avoid what was coming. The second was the black box data, mechanical, definitive, and entirely resistant to alternative interpretation. Full throttle, zero braking, 5 seconds of a foot that never lifted. The third was the relationship evidence, the text spanning years, the prior threats, the witness who heard Mackenzie say, "I will crash this car right now," just 2 weeks before she did, and the GPS data showing she had already been on that road before that morning. For the defense, attorney Jim McDonnell built his argument around a medical condition. He argued that Mackenzie suffered from postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, known as POTS, a disorder affecting blood circulation that can cause sudden episodes of lightheadedness, loss of balance, and in some cases a complete loss of consciousness. He argued she had blacked out at the wheel, that what the black box recorded was not intention, but the physical consequence of an unconscious body slumped against an accelerator. Her mother, Natalie Shirilla, testified that Mackenzie had fainted on prior occasions. McDonnell pushed the argument that the prosecution had not met its burden of proving intent, that there was a meaningful legal difference between reckless driving that ends in death and deliberate murder, and that the evidence did not close that gap beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutor Troop answered that argument directly and methodically. If Mackenzie had a diagnosed condition that caused her to lose consciousness without warning, he asked, why was she still behind the wheel of a car at all? He then pointed to the black box data with specific focus, not on the speed alone, but on the pattern of acceleration in those final 5 seconds. A foot that has gone limp and unconscious does not press harder on a gas pedal. An unconscious body does not accelerate a vehicle. It coasts. It slows. It does not drive faster into a brick wall. On August 14th, 2023, Judge Nancy Margaret Russo delivered her verdict. Mackenzie broke down in tears as the judge spoke. The judge said her actions were controlled, methodical, deliberate, intentional, and purposeful. She said this was not reckless driving. She said this was murder. She described Mackenzie as having transformed from a responsible driver into, in her exact words, literal hell on wheels as she made her way down that street. She added that Mackenzie had a mission and that she executed it with precision. The mission, the judge said, was death. Guilty on all 12 counts. 1 week later, on August 21st, 2023, the courtroom filled for sentencing. The families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan addressed the court. Dominic's sister Christine stood and said what no sibling should ever have to say in a room like that. She said they do not get out in 15 years. They do not come back in 15 years. They do not get any chance to live a life. Mackenzie then spoke, reading from a brief prepared statement. She said she was so deeply sorry. She said she hoped one day they could see she would never let this happen or do it on purpose. She called Dominic her soulmate. She said she wished she could take all their pain away. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo sentenced Mackenzie Shirilla to 2 concurrent terms of 15 years to life. Concurrent, not consecutive, a structuring the judge herself described as an act of mercy. She will serve a minimum of 15 years rather than 30. Her driver's license was suspended for life. She received credit for time already served. Her first parole hearing is scheduled for October 2037. She will be 33 years old. For 3 years, Mackenzie Shirilla said nothing publicly. Not to police before her arrest. Not to investigators after it. Not on the stand during her own trial. Not in any interview, any statement, any press release filtered through her attorneys. For 3 years, the only version of Mackenzie Shirilla that existed in the public record was the one constructed from text messages, body cam footage, social media posts, and a verdict read aloud by a judge who called her actions murder. Then in 2026, she said yes to Netflix. The documentary titled The Crash premiered on May 15, 2026, directed by Garrett Johnson and produced by Angharad Scott. It became the #1 most watched movie on Netflix globally in its debut week. It features body cam footage from the arrest, surveillance video of the crash, cell phone recordings, courtroom footage, and interviews with family members connected to all 3 people who were in that car. But the centerpiece, the thing that made the documentary an immediate cultural event, was something nobody had seen before. Mackenzie Shirilla, sitting inside the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, speaking on camera for the first time since the night of the crash. Her attorney was present throughout, but remained off camera. When the filmmakers were asked how they secured her participation, director Garrett Johnson said she had never been interviewed by police either before or after her arrest, and that it would be unprecedented if she agreed to speak to them. Luckily, he said, she said yes. When Mackenzie herself was asked in the documentary why she had chosen now, after 3 years of total silence, to finally speak, she said, "I have never spoken before, and I have never told my side of the story. I understand there are many different sides and perspectives, but I just want to say my truth." And here is what her truth sounds like when she finally gives it voice. She does not confess. She does not apologize in the way someone apologizes when they are acknowledging what they did. She says she loved Dominic and that she would never hurt him. She says the most logical explanation for what happened that morning is a medical emergency. She says she remembers nothing from those final moments on Progress Drive. When the filmmakers press her on the GPS data showing she had been on that road before, and on the black box data showing active acceleration in the final 5 seconds, she rejects the conclusions drawn from both. She says the data does not tell the full story. But then she says something that stops the documentary cold. She looks at the camera and she says, "I am not saying I am innocent. I was a driver of a tragedy, but I am not a murderer." Sit with that for a moment. I am not saying I am innocent. That is not the language of someone claiming full exoneration. That is not what you say when you're arguing the evidence was fabricated or the verdict was entirely wrong. That is something else entirely, and legal analysts who watched the film flagged it immediately. Because Mackenzie Shirilla is still an incarcerated person with an active appeal before the Ohio Supreme Court. And the parole board that will sit across from her in October 2037 will watch this documentary too. While Mackenzie's mother Natalie has maintained a quieter, more composed public presence, working through legal channels, staying close to the appeals process, keeping her grief mostly private, Mackenzie's father, Steve Shirilla, became a story entirely his own in the weeks following the Netflix documentary release. And it is a story that managed to cause fresh pain to people who had already been through more than enough. Steve Shirilla is an art and digital media teacher at Mary Queen of Peace School, a Catholic school in Cleveland. On May 27th, 2026, he appeared on a podcast called True Crime This Week, and said things that immediately ignited a new wave of public outrage around a case that was already consuming the internet. In that interview, Steve claimed there had been some collusion in his daughter's murder trial. He alleged that the Russo family was a political family and that the last name Russo carried weight and influence in the Cleveland area, implying, without stating it directly, that this influence had shaped the outcome of the case against his daughter. He then said something that landed far harder than anything else in that interview. He said, if it was just Davion in the car, she would not be in jail. He followed that immediately by saying, "And I apologize to the Flanagan family right now for that." That apology came in the same breath as the statement. It did not land as genuine remorse. It landed as a man who knew he had gone too far the moment the words left his mouth, but could not take them back. Because what he had said, stripped of everything around it, was that Davion Flanagan life mattered less. That his death alone would not have been enough to put Mackenzie behind bars. That the weight of the case rested on Dominic Russo's last name and his family's connections, not on the fact that 2 young men died on Progress Drive at 5:34 in the morning. Mary Queen of Peace School responded swiftly. The school released a statement saying administrators were investigating allegations that one of their teachers had demonstrated poor judgment and that upon learning of the situation, the school had acted immediately and placed the teacher on administrative leave pending investigation. Steve then appeared on TMZ Live, where he insisted the Netflix filmmakers had taken his comments out of context and maintained that there was zero evidence of intent and prior calculation in his daughter's case. The Flanagan family, who had already endured 3 years of watching Davion be treated as a footnote in his own death, had nothing left to say publicly. Their silence in response to Steve Shirilla's words said everything that needed to be said. Since her conviction in August 2023, Mackenzie Shirilla's legal team has filed 3 separate attempts to get the case reconsidered, reopened, or overturned. 3 attempts. None have succeeded. But the third, the one currently sitting before the Ohio Supreme Court as of June 2026, is the most serious effort yet, and it carries with it a piece of medical evidence that has never once been formally heard inside a courtroom. The first appeal was filed in September 2023 by her original legal team. It argued insufficient evidence and pointed to multiple procedural and clerical errors during the trial. It was denied outright and dismissed without significant engagement from the reviewing court. The second appeal was filed in April 2025. It was also denied, rejected so quickly and so completely that it barely registered as a legal event in the public record. Then came the third attempt, and this one was built differently. On April 3rd, 2025, Mackenzie's new legal team at Marine and Bradley LLC, attorneys John T. Martin and Stephen L. Bradley, operating out of Cleveland, submitted a supplemental post-conviction petition to the court. Attached to that petition was something that had never been part of any prior legal proceeding in this case. An affidavit from Dr. Kamal Chamali, a neurologist at University Hospitals in Cleveland. Dr. Chamali had reviewed Mackenzie's post-crash medical records in detail and concluded that the data contained within those records was consistent with a loss of consciousness at the time of the crash. He pointed specifically to 3 things: her elevated lactate levels immediately following the crash, her abnormally low blood oxygen levels, and her complete post-crash amnesia. He argued these were classic clinical markers of a seizure or a similar autonomic neurological event, entirely consistent with her previously diagnosed POTS condition. This is the evidence that was never investigated by her original trial attorney, Jim McDonnell. This is the evidence that was never placed before Judge Nancy Margaret Russo during the 4-day bench trial. A neurologist reviewed her medical records and found findings consistent with loss of consciousness. And that finding never made it into the courtroom where her fate was being decided. The problem that derailed this petition before it could be properly heard was entirely procedural. The petition was filed on October 24th, 2024, one single day past the 365-day legal deadline for post-conviction filings. One day, her legal team argued that the miscalculation occurred because 2024 was a leap year, adding an extra day to the calendar that their deadline calculation had not accounted for. The 8th District Court of Appeals reviewed that argument in March 2026 and rejected it entirely. So on April 27, 2026, Mackenzie's attorneys filed case number 2026-0519 with the Ohio Supreme Court. The argument before the state's highest court rests on 2 foundations. First, that the legal clock governing her filing deadline should have started later than it did, based on a separately filed transcript from the juvenile bind-over hearing that preceded her adult trial. Second, and more significantly, that Mackenzie received ineffective assistance of counsel at trial because her original attorney, Jim McDonnell, never investigated or obtained the medical evidence that Dr. Chamali's affidavit now documents. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, led by Michael C. O'Malley, has formally asked the Ohio Supreme Court to dismiss the appeal entirely. As of June 2026, the court has not yet announced whether it will agree to hear the case at all. That decision is still coming, and when it arrives, it will determine whether the most significant piece of medical evidence in Mackenzie Shirilla's defense ever gets its day in court. While legal arguments travel through appellate courts and land on the desks of Supreme Court justices in Columbus, Two families are still waking up every single morning to the reality of what happened on Progress Drive at 5:34 in the morning on July 31st, 2022. The courts move on timelines measured in months and years. Grief does not operate on a timeline at all. Dominic Russo's sister Christine has been the most consistently public voice among the families throughout this entire case. After the Netflix documentary premiered in May 2026 and reignited public debate about her brother's death, Christine told interviewers that Mackenzie would not leave Dominic's side and that she fits the profile of an abusive partner who puts on a very good front in front of other people. She said she has spoken with women inside the Ohio Reformatory for Women who have told her that Mackenzie's manipulative patterns have not stopped behind bars. She also pointed to jail calls released by Strongsville police that she believes show Mackenzie and her mother Natalie using coded language during recorded calls, speaking in a way designed to avoid being clearly understood by anyone monitoring those conversations. The Flanagan family has remained far more private throughout. They have not sought media appearances. They have not given documentary interviews. They have grieved Davion largely away from the cameras and the comment sections and the true crime forums that have turned this case into a years-long public debate. And then Steve Shirilla's podcast comment arrived in May 2026 and pulled them back into a spotlight they never asked for, forcing the family of a 19-year-old aspiring barber and youth swim coach to once again defend the weight of his life against the suggestion that his death alone would not have mattered enough. As for Mackenzie herself, now 21 years old inside the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, the adjustment to prison life has not been smooth by any documented measure. Since entering in 2023, she has accumulated 36 prison conduct reports. She has been found guilty of 32 of them. The violations include possession of contraband, refusing work assignments, and most recently in May 2026, refusing to carry out a job detail. The minimum of 15 years she must serve before facing a parole board has barely begun. October 2037 is still more than a decade away. Here is where everything stands right now, as of June 2026. Mackenzie Shirilla is 21 years old and is serving 2 concurrent 15 to life sentences inside the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, Ohio. She will not sit before a parole board until October 2037, when she will be 33 years old. Her case is currently before the Ohio Supreme Court under case number 2026-20519, filed April 27, 2026. The court has not yet announced whether it will agree to hear the appeal at all. The Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office has asked for it to be thrown out entirely. Dr. Kamal Chumali's medical affidavit, the neurologist who reviewed her post-crash records and concluded the data was consistent with a loss of consciousness, has never once been formally heard inside a courtroom. Dominic Russo is 20 years old forever. Davion Flanagan, the youth swim coach, the aspiring barber, the young man who had absolutely nothing to do with whatever was happening between Mackenzie and Dominic, who simply got into the wrong car at the wrong time on the wrong morning, is 19 years old forever. And here is the question I am leaving with you tonight. The black box says her foot never left the gas in those final 5 seconds. The neurologist says her post-crash medical data is consistent with blacking out. The GPS says she visited that road in the days before the crash. And she sat in front of a Netflix camera in 2026, looked directly into the lens, and said, "I am not saying I am innocent, but I am not a murderer." You have heard everything. You have heard the text, the timeline, the black box, the dry run, the social media posts, the trial, the verdict, the appeals, and her own words spoken in her own voice for the very first time. So now it is your turn. Drop your verdict in the comments below. And if you want to follow where this case goes next, because the Ohio Supreme Court decision is still coming and this story is not finished, subscribe to Viral Case Files and hit the bell so you do not miss it. I cover cases like this every single week. I will see you in the next one.